In November of 1922, in Egypt's Valley of the Kings, a man stood in the dust staring at a hole in the ground that could change history forever. For years, British archaeologist Howard Carter had searched this barren valley under the scorching Egyptian sun. Other explorers had already combed the area and declared it exhausted. Most people believed the tombs worth finding had already been found. Money was running out. Lord Carnarvon was losing patience. This was supposed to be Carter's last season. And then, almost by accident, everything changed. A water boy is said to have uncovered a step cut into the bedrock beneath the sand. One step, then another. Carter and his team began clearing the staircase. Slowly, the shape of a sealed doorway emerged. Stamped into the plaster were marks no archaeologist could ignore. Royal seals. A royal tomb. Possibly untouched. Carter knew enough to stop immediately. He sent a telegram to Carnarvon in England with the kind of message that can make a man cross continents. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Weeks later, Carnarvon arrived in Egypt with his daughter, Lady Evelyn. The tension was unbearable. Imagine the scene: moonlight over the valley, ancient cliffs towering in silence, workers holding lamps, the air thick with dust and anticipation. In front of them stood a doorway sealed for over 3,000 years. Carter made a tiny hole in the upper corner of the second sealed entrance and inserted a candle. Hot air rushed out from the tomb, causing the flame to flicker. Carnarvon, unable to contain himself, asked the question history would never forget. "Can you see anything?" And Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things." Those two words opened a portal to another world. Behind that doorway was not an empty ruin, not a looted chamber stripped bare, but a dazzling chaos of ancient luxury. Furniture stacked on top of furniture, chariots, thrones, strange black guardian statues standing like sentinels in the dark, golden couches shaped like divine beasts, boxes, weapons, jewelry, ceremonial objects. Everywhere the candlelight touched, something gleamed. It was as if time itself had been sealed inside. For the modern world, this was not just an archaeological discovery, it was a shockwave. The world had never seen an ancient royal burial so rich, so intimate, so visually overwhelming. And this was only the beginning. The tomb of Tutankhamun was not the largest in the Valley of the Kings. In fact, it was surprisingly small for a pharaoh. That alone added mystery. Why did a king of Egypt rest in such a modest tomb? Why had it survived when the grander tombs had been robbed? And who exactly was Tutankhamun? At that moment, Carter didn't have all the answers. What he did have was a maze of chambers packed with thousands of objects, each one whispering something about the life, death, and beliefs of a ruler buried more than 3,000 years ago. The first room, known today as the antechamber, looked less like a neat royal burial and more like a treasure vault frozen mid-motion. Gilded beds with animal heads, dismantled chariots, carved alabaster vessels, massive ceremonial fans, walking sticks, bows, arrows, linen, games, food containers, statues. It was not just treasure for display, it was an entire afterlife kit. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end, it was a journey, and a king did not travel lightly. Every item had a purpose: chariots for movement, thrones for power, jewelry for protection, oils and perfumes for purification, weapons for defense. Magic was woven into every object.
The tomb was not merely a grave, it was a machine designed to carry a divine ruler into eternity. And then there was the gold. Gold was everywhere, not because it was simply valuable, but because to the Egyptians, gold was the flesh of the gods. It did not tarnish, it did not decay, it glowed with the permanence of the sun. In Tutankhamun's tomb, gold turned death into spectacle. One of the most famous objects found there was the king's throne, a masterpiece of gold, colored glass, and semi-precious stones. On its back, Tutankhamun sits with his queen, Ankhesenamun, in a scene so tender and human it feels startlingly modern. This wasn't just propaganda, it felt intimate, a royal couple bathed in golden light, suspended between divinity and real life. Then came the nested shrines and coffins in the burial chamber itself. To reach Tutankhamun's mummy, Carter's team had to work through layer after layer of sacred protection. First, huge gilded wooden shrines filled the burial chamber wall to wall, like golden boxes inside boxes. Inside them was a stone sarcophagus. Inside that were 3 coffins, each fitted inside the next. The innermost coffin was solid gold. Solid gold. And then, resting over the face of the dead king, was the object that would become one of the most iconic images in human history, the funerary mask of Tutankhamun. Blue and gold, calm and eternal, the face of a teenage king transformed into divine perfection, the striped Nemes headdress, the cobra and vulture at the brow, the inlaid quartz and obsidian eyes that seem almost alive. It is not just beautiful, it is unsettling. It feels like someone is still there, looking back. That mask became the face of ancient Egypt itself. But buried beneath the spectacle was an uncomfortable truth. The body inside belonged not to a mighty conquering ruler in the mold of Ramesses the Great, but to a young king who died before reaching adulthood. Tutankhamun was around 19 years old when he died, a teenager wrapped in unimaginable wealth and divine symbolism. And that changed the emotional center of the story, because now this was not the story of treasure, it was the story of interruption, a life cut short, a king buried in haste, a tomb packed with wonders, yes, but also full of clues suggesting that something about this burial was unusual. Some object seemed repurposed, some inscriptions may have been altered, the tomb itself may not even have been originally intended for him. It was as if the machinery of royal burial had been forced to move too quickly after an unexpected death. And in that contrast between the enormous splendor and the briefness of the life, Tutankhamun became something more than a pharaoh. He became a mystery. Who was this boy king really? Why did he matter enough to receive such treasures, yet vanish so quickly from history? How did he die? Accident, illness, murder, weakness hidden behind a golden mask. The deeper Carter's team went into the tomb, the more dazzling it became, and the more haunting, because every object glittering in the lamplight raised the same question: what happened to the boy inside? And outside the tomb, another story was already beginning to spread through the world. A darker story. A story of bad luck, death, and something ancient waking up. The curse of the Pharaoh. That legend would help turn Tutankhamun from an archaeological wonder into a global obsession. But before the curse came the king himself. And the truth about Tutankhamun's life was, in many ways, just as mysterious as his death.
Tutankhamun became world famous because of his tomb, but during his own lifetime,
he may not have seemed destined for greatness at all. His birth was into one of the most turbulent moments in ancient Egyptian history. His father is widely believed to have been Akhenaten, the controversial pharaoh who tried to revolutionize Egyptian religion. For centuries, Egypt had worshipped a vast pantheon of gods: Amun, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and many more. But Akhenaten tried to tear all of that down and center worship on a single solar deity, the Aten. It was a radical upheaval. Temples were abandoned, priests lost power, traditional beliefs were overturned. Even Egypt's artistic style changed into something strange, elongated, and dreamlike. Akhenaten built a new capital and tried to reshape reality itself. Then the experiment collapsed. Into that chaos stepped a child. Originally named Tutankhamun, meaning living image of Aten, the young king came to the throne at around 8 or 9 years old. But not long after, his name changed to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. That change was not cosmetic, it was political. It signaled a dramatic reversal. Under the boy king's reign, or more accurately under the officials guiding him, Egypt moved back toward traditional religion. The old gods returned, the temples reopened, the state attempted to heal itself. So Tutankhamun's life, brief as it was, sat at the center of a national reset. But the king himself remains elusive. We have his statues, his treasures, his mummy, his mask, yet his personal voice is almost silent. He ruled, but others likely ruled around him and through him. Powerful advisors, priests, and military figures may have shaped many of the major decisions of his reign. He was both a living pharaoh and perhaps a carefully protected symbol. And then he died, suddenly, at around 19. That one fact ignited a century of speculation. For decades, people wondered whether Tutankhamun had been murdered. A blow to the head was once proposed as evidence. Political intrigue made the theory irresistible. A fragile young king, a court filled with ambitious men, a sudden death. It sounded like the perfect ancient thriller. But the mummy had more to say. Modern scans and scientific studies revealed a more complicated picture. Tutankhamun appears to have had several health problems. He may have had a clubfoot or other physical issues that made walking difficult. The many canes found in his tomb suddenly looked less ceremonial and more personal. He may have also suffered from malaria. Some evidence suggests a leg fracture shortly before death. Rather than a clean murder mystery, the reality may have been tragic and messy. A physically vulnerable young king struck by illness, injury, or both. And somehow, that is even sadder, because it means the shining golden face we know so well may have hidden a frail and suffering teenager, carrying the burden of divine kingship on a damaged body. Then came the curse. The phrase "curse of the pharaoh" is now part of global folklore, but its real power began after the tomb's opening. The media, especially newspapers hungry for sensation, seized on rumors that ancient warnings had been found near the burial. Stories spread of ominous inscriptions promising death to those who disturbed the king's rest. Then Lord Carnarvon died in 1923, just months after the tomb was opened. That was all the world needed. Carnarvon had been bitten by a mosquito, cut the bite while shaving, and later died from infection. But facts rarely stand a chance against a good curse. Newspapers turned his death into proof of supernatural revenge. They piled on every strange coincidence they could find.
Stories circulated that the lights of Cairo went out when he died, that his dog howled in England at the exact same moment and dropped dead, that misfortune stalked everyone connected to the tomb. The curse had everything: ancient kings, forbidden chambers, sudden death, colonial intrigue, superstition, greed, and the thrilling possibility that the dead were not as powerless as they seemed. The truth, of course, was less cinematic and more human. Many people involved with the excavation lived long lives. Howard Carter himself did not die young from any curse. He lived for many years afterwards. But by then, it didn't matter. The curse had escaped the tomb and entered mythology. And that may be Tutankhamun's strangest legacy of all. He was not the most powerful pharaoh, not the greatest builder, not the greatest conqueror, not the longest reigning king, and yet he became the most famous. Why? Because Tutankhamun arrived at the exact moment the modern world was ready to fall in love with ancient Egypt. The discovery exploded across newspapers, magazines, lectures, photographs, and museum culture. Suddenly, Egypt was everywhere. Fashion borrowed Egyptian motifs, jewelry echoed scarabs, lotuses, and bold geometric forms. Architecture and design absorbed the sleek lines and symbolism of the tomb. The discovery fed directly into the Art Deco age, where luxury, symmetry, and exotic inspiration were already in the air. Hollywood took notice too. Mummies, curses, tombs, lost civilizations, and ancient revenge became staples of American entertainment. The image of the wrapped mummy stalking the living, the forbidden excavation, the doom awaiting those who open the wrong door, all of it owes something to the frenzy surrounding Tutankhamun. Even when later films got the history wildly wrong, they were still drawing power from the same source: the feeling that somewhere beneath the sand, the past is not dead, it is waiting. And Tutankhamun never really left pop culture after that. His golden mask became instantly recognizable around the world, reproduced in textbooks, posters, documentaries, cartoons, album art, and blockbuster exhibitions. For millions of Americans, Tutankhamun became their first doorway into ancient history, not through a classroom, but through awe. Through that impossible face of blue and gold, through the fantasy of buried treasure, through the chill of the curse. He became history's perfect paradox, a king forgotten for centuries, then rediscovered and made immortal by the very people who disturbed his sleep. That is what makes the story so powerful. It begins in silence, under the desert, with a sealed door and a flickering candle. It opens into rooms overflowing with gold. It leads us to a child king trapped inside a collapsing dynasty. It tempts us with murder, disease, and supernatural revenge. And it ends with something even stranger than a curse: fame. A teenager who ruled for only a few years became one of the most recognizable faces on Earth. 3,000 years after his death, Tutankhamun still does what few rulers ever achieve. He commands attention. He makes us stare. He makes us wonder what else is still hidden. And in the end, maybe that's the real curse of Tutankhamun. Not that he kills those who enter his tomb, but that once you step into his story, you never quite leave it.